Welcome, this is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Kasia Madeira. Our main stories. The UK Conservative Party chairman Nadeem Zahawi says that an error in his tax affairs was accepted by authorities as having been careless and not deliberate. President Zelensky says that he'll keep asking Western allies to send modern tanks to Ukraine after a meeting of more than 50 countries ended without agreement.
We will still have to fight for the supply of modern tanks, but every day we make it more obvious there is no alternative to making the decision on tanks.
Turkey cancels a visit to Ankara by the Swedish Defence Minister after authorities in Sweden give permission for a protest by a far-right politician. And Britain's Andy Murray's out of the Australian Open. He lost to Spain's Roberto Bautista Agut in 4 sets in what could be his last time at the tournament. Hello and welcome. The UK Conservative Party chairman Nadeem Zahawi has responded to reports that he had to pay a penalty as part of a multi-million-pound settlement. In a statement, the former Chancellor said that the tax office had disagreed about the exact allocation of shares his father had in the polling company YouGov, which Mr Zahawi had founded. He said that the UK's tax authority, the HMRC, had concluded it was a careless and not deliberate error and that he'd paid what was due. Well, the Labour opposition party had earlier called for Mr Zahawi to resign over the matter. Our political correspondent Jonathan Blake has more on today's statement.
Yes, for almost a week now, Nadeem Zahawi has been under pressure to give more detail about his tax affairs. And there's one central question at the heart of this scrutiny, and that is whether he used an offshore entity to hold shares in the polling company YouGov, which he set up before he came into politics back in the year 2000, and also whether subsequently he has paid a settlement to HMRC for tax that he owed as a result of potentially avoiding capital gains tax, having put those shares in the offshore firm, and on top of that paid a penalty because of the mistake that was made. There was a report yesterday in the Guardian newspaper that claimed the total amount paid was £4.8 million. The Sun on Sunday made the initial report last weekend that Mr Zahawi had indeed paid a settlement to HMRC while this to end this potential dispute. We'd had no denial from Mr Zahawi or his team about those two central claims, but very little detail until now, other than a very short statement saying that his taxes were up to date and he has effectively paid what he'd owed.
We had this statement. It's a full statement. Just talk us through what we need to look out for.
Yes, well, he starts off by saying that he knows scrutiny and propriety are important parts of public life, and he wants to address some of the confusion, as he puts it, about his finances. And it's regarding the setting up of YouGov, which I mentioned, that he focuses on in this statement, saying that when he set it up, he didn't have the money or expertise to go it alone, so he asked his father for help. He took founder shares in the business, he said, in exchange for some capital and his invaluable guidance. He then moves on to when he was being appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, which was under Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Briefly, for a couple of months, he held that office. Questions were raised, he says, about his tax affairs. He discussed this with the Cabinet Office at the time. The statement goes on to say that following discussions with HMRC, they agreed that my father was entitled to founder shares in YouGov, though they disagreed about the exact allocation. He goes on, they concluded that this was a careless and not a deliberate error, and that he chose to settle the matter and pay what they said was due. So a lot of detail there, but to unpick it, I think at the centre of this is a disparity or a disagreement around how many shares Nadeem Zahawi's father was holding in YouGov, the company which he set up with his help, we now learn at the time, and whether he was holding more shares as a founder than he was entitled to or allowed to. But the upshot of it is he's acknowledged that he paid a settlement to HMRC. He hasn't talked about exact amounts of money. He hasn't talked specifically about paying a penalty, just paying the amount that was due. So going into some detail here about the ins and outs of the company he set up, but effectively admitting to those two key claims that we've been reporting over the last few days, that he did indeed pay a significant sum of money to settle a dispute over his taxes, and over and above that, it seems, a penalty as well.
So our political correspondent there, Jonathan Blake, speaking about the Conservative Party chairman, Nadhim Zahawi. Well, he's not the only one who's been under the spotlight. The Prime Minister also has had a lot of attention. A senior Labour MP has accused Rishi Sunak of failing to deliver the integrity and the professionalism that he promised. And this is after he was fined for not wearing a seatbelt. Sir Chris Bryant, who chairs the Common Standards Committee, said that Rishi Sunak had shown a pattern of misjudgment. Well, Lancashire Police issued a fixed penalty notice after Mr Sunak posted this video, which was shot in the backseat of a car where he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Well, a little earlier, I caught up with the Conservative councillor and former special advisor Claire Pearsall, and I discussed with her whether the issues that both the Prime Minister and Nadhim Zahawi were having an impact on the Conservative Party.
I think this statement actually raises more questions than it solves. The whole process of Nadhim Zahawi's tax concerns seemed to be very, very complicated. It seems to be tied up in offshore accounts, which is always going to be messy. And although this has been passed through the Cabinet Secretary prior to Mr Zahawi's stint as Chancellor, it does seem that this has been rumbling on for some time. It should have been clarified a lot sooner. And I think there really are still more questions to be asked of him, and a bit more clarity as to the state of this trust and why these so-called sort of careless, not deliberate mistakes have been made. This is quite a lot of money. We aren't talking about a couple of £100. This is a substantial amount for it to be wrong. So I think we need to learn a little bit more detail before anybody can unwind it any further.
I think when it comes to the sum, I've just got to stress that, and just be completely transparent, the BBC hasn't verified the exact amount. But when it comes to the statement from Zahawi, he says that HMRC, the UK's tax authority, has said that they concluded that this was a careless and not a deliberate error. I just wonder, though, given that he was in charge of the UK's finances, of the UK's tax authority, of the UK's tax system, is his position, should he have paid more care when it comes to however this company was initially set up?
He absolutely should. If you are going to be the person in charge of making the rest of the United Kingdom pay their taxes and setting the level of taxes, and we do have a very complicated system, then you need to make sure that your own affairs are in order. So I think that he really does need to put a little bit more clarity. The question is the fact that during his stint as Chancellor and now as party chairman, he needs to be above the law. He needs to be absolutely transparent, which is what Rishi Sunak, when he became Prime Minister, said that he would have.
Well, when we talk about Rishi Sunak, we've heard about the situation with the next penalty notice. That's for the video where he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. I just wonder, he became Prime Minister. He was talking about the need for integrity. What is happening with the Conservative Party? What is their position right now?
It's very, very difficult. It seems every single day we get another headline. We've had Rishi Sunak's fixed penalty notice, which is quite right. He was banged to rights. You could see from the footage he wasn't wearing a seatbelt in the back of the car, which is law. So I don't think there was any case to answer. I think the police acted in exactly the correct way. But we're now being overtaken with Nadhim Zahawi and his tax affairs, which has been rumbling on, especially over the last week. And you just think, is this a little lack of attention to detail about what's going on around him? Is he not paying attention as Prime Minister to his cabinet members, to his backbenchers, to junior ministers, because there seems to be almost this sense of a free-for-all going on. People are saying things perhaps on the media that they needn't have said. These kind of scandals are going to come out. It all feels a little bit chaotic, and I had hoped that when Boris Johnson left the post as Prime Minister that we would see an end to that. But unfortunately, it's just carried on.
Former Conservative Special Advisor Claire Pearsall. Now to Ukraine's President Zelensky says that he'll keep asking Western allies to send modern tanks to Ukraine after a meeting of allied nations in Germany ended without
modern tanks.
Zelensky has made his appeal. Berlin gets to decide where the Leopard tanks are deployed. The US is also under pressure to make its Abrams tanks available to Ukraine.
We'll continue to support the defence of Ukraine.
Domestic politics, its punks units are
in the crack. There was a through them. Buzz Aldrin has celebrated his list. There they are.